In air combat, survival is not about courage. It is about obedience. Obedience to rules written not in manuals, but in wreckage scattered across fields and forests. Every pilot who flew over Europe in that war learned them quickly, or did not live long enough to matter. One of those rules was never debated, never argued. When you are outnumbered and the enemy controls the sky around you, you do not climb. You dive, you run, you trade altitude for speed, and pray the ground comes before the bullets do. Climbing bleeds energy. Climbing exposes weakness. Climbing is what you do when you have nothing left to lose. By the spring of 1944, this was not theory. It was consensus. German pilots believed it. American pilots believed it. Training reflected it. Combat reports confirmed it. At high altitude, weight was a curse, and the heavier the aircraft, the sooner it paid the price. Fighters that lingered too long in the thin air became slow, then helpless, then dead. Men learned to recognize that moment when an airplane stopped responding the way it should, when the controls softened, when the engine no longer answered the throttle with authority, when gravity began to negotiate on terms you could not refuse. That is why, when 11 German fighters began to converge on a lone American P-47 Thunderbolt, there was no urgency in their movements, no reckless diving attacks, no desperate head-ons. From their perspective, this was already decided. The American had drifted out of position. He was alone. And worse, he was flying an aircraft that everyone knew was not built for prolonged vertical fights. The Thunderbolt was strong, yes, durable, able to take punishment and keep flying, but it was heavy. 7 tons of metal, fuel, and armor wrapped around a massive radial engine. It did not dance. It did not pivot gracefully. In turning fights, it bled speed like a wounded animal. German pilots had learned this early in the air war. They had baited Thunderbolts before, pulled them into climbing turns, forced them to commit to vertical maneuvers they could not sustain, then finished them when physics did the rest. This was not bravado, it was method, and method had kept them alive. So as they closed the distance, tightening their geometry, watching the Americans' options collapse one by one, they were calm. They did not need to rush. The sky itself would do the work. From their cockpits, the situation looked familiar. The American was boxed in. Below him, lower altitude where diving would only make him faster prey. Around him, converging fighters, each covering the other's blind spots. Above him, the thin air cold, unforgiving, and lethal to aircraft that overstayed their welcome. Every escape route had already been anticipated. Every outcome mapped. The only question left was how long it would take before the Thunderbolt made the inevitable choice. This certainty is important because it explains what happened next. The German pilots were not careless. They were confident. And confidence in war is rarely punished immediately. It erodes slowly, only revealing itself as a mistake when it is already too late to correct. They expected the American to do what every pilot was trained to do: push the nose down, build speed, try to outrun the net closing around him, or, failing that, commit to a fight he could not win and die quickly. What they did not expect, what no one expected, was that the American would reject the rule that governed all of this. Not out of panic, not out of desperation, but deliberately, calmly, as if he had already decided that the sky above him was not a wall, but a door. And that decision, made in a few silent seconds inside a shaking cockpit, is where the story truly begins. The trap did not close all at once. It never does. In air combat, the most dangerous moments are quiet, when everyone involved believes the outcome is already decided. The German pilots did not tighten their circle aggressively. They widened it just enough to deny escape, just enough to give the American room to make the mistake they were waiting for. This was not hunting with teeth bared. This was waiting for gravity to finish the job. From their perspective, the Thunderbolt was already bleeding options. Every second spent maneuvering burned fuel. Every adjustment of the controls cost energy. At this altitude, there was no excess to waste. They watched his speed. They watched his angle. They listened to their radios and spoke in short, measured bursts. No excitement, no fear, only confirmation. He was still there, still boxed in, still alone. Inside the American cockpit, the situation looked very different, but no less grim. The aircraft shook under the strain of constant correction. The controls were firm but heavy, reminding him of the weight he carried. He could feel the drag building whenever he tried to turn. He knew what waited below him. A dive would buy speed, but it would also commit him to a chase he could not outrun. The lighter German fighters would follow, faster at low altitude, quicker to recover, quicker to reposition. He had seen pilots die that way, watched them dive for salvation and find only a faster death. He also knew what surrounded him. Every turn he made was watched, every change in attitude noted. 11 sets of eyes measuring distance, closure rates, angles. There was no confusion on their side, no chaos. This was control. And control is deadly. What mattered most in those moments was not what he could do, but what he refused to do. He did not yank the stick. He did not commit to a desperate turn. He did not let the aircraft bleed speed unnecessarily. That restraint mattered. In war, panic is louder than gunfire, and it kills faster. He kept his movements small, economical, as if he were conserving something precious that no one else could see yet. The Germans interpreted this restraint as weakness, a pilot running out of ideas, a man delaying the inevitable. They tightened their positions just enough to discourage any sudden break. One aircraft pressed slightly higher. Another drifted lower. Angles closed, lines crossed. From above, it would have looked like patience. From below, like inevitability. Altitude was the silent judge in all of this. Above 20,000 feet, the margin for error shrank to nothing. Engines began to lose their authority. Air thinned. Lift weakened. Pilots learned to read these changes, not on instruments, but in their hands and bones. The Thunderbolt felt heavy, but it felt honest. It told him what it was doing. It told him what it could still give. The Germans trusted different signals. Their aircraft were lighter, more responsive, built for climbing into the fight and diving back out. They trusted that advantage, trusted the feel of their machines the way men trust habits that have kept them alive before. And those habits told them the same story they had always told. No aircraft this heavy could climb long enough to escape. Not here. Not now. So they waited. They waited for the nose to dip, for the inevitable attempt to run, for the moment the American would choose speed over altitude, because that was what every pilot was taught to do when surrounded. They did not know that the most dangerous decision in combat is not the reckless one. It is the one that looks wrong to everyone watching. The American glanced at his gauges, not in panic, not in hope, just confirmation. Temperatures steady, pressure holding, fuel enough to gamble. The aircraft was not failing him. It was waiting, and waiting, in war, is sometimes the clearest signal you will ever get. He looked up into the thin blue sky above him, past the altitude where most fights ended, past the band where men felt comfortable, past the place where instinct told you to stop. What he saw there was not safety. It was risk of a different kind. A risk that did not rely on outturning or outrunning anyone. A risk that relied on understanding exactly where the enemy's confidence ended. The German pilots believed they had sealed every exit. They believed the sky above them belonged to physics, and physics was on their side. They did not realize that the trap they had built depended entirely on the American accepting the same rules they did, and he was about to refuse. The decision did not arrive with drama. There was no surge of adrenaline, no sudden clarity granted by fate. It came the way most real decisions in war come quietly, stripped of illusion, reduced to what still worked and what did not. The American pilot understood something the moment demanded but did not explain. He understood that every move the Germans expected him to make would end the same way. Down meant pursuit. Turning meant exhaustion. Fighting meant being cut apart by numbers. Familiar paths all led to the same place. So he chose the unfamiliar one. He eased the nose up, not violently, not in defiance, but with control. A measured pull, enough to convert speed into altitude without tearing the aircraft apart. The Thunderbolt responded the way heavy machines do when they are treated properly, not eagerly, but faithfully. The airspeed began to fall. The horizon dropped. The altimeter started to unwind in the wrong direction. at least by every rule the Germans believed in. From the outside, it looked like a mistake. German pilots saw it immediately. The American was climbing. Not rolling, not breaking away, climbing straight into thinner air. Their reaction was instinctive and unanimous. Follow him. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment where weight and drag and oxygen starvation would do their work. They pushed their throttles forward and pulled up behind him, confident that the laws of flight would finish what bullets had not yet started. Inside the American cockpit, the world narrowed to instruments and pressure. The controls grew softer, less precise. Every correction took more effort. The engine's note changed as the air thinned, the sound losing its fullness, but not its strength. He adjusted without looking, hands moving from habit rather than thought. Trim, throttle, mixture, small changes, constant attention. He did not fight the aircraft. He listened to it. This was not a maneuver taught in training. There were no instructors' voices echoing in his head. Training ended where manuals stopped being useful. Beyond that, there was only experience and judgment. He knew he was gambling. He knew the margin was thin. At this altitude, mistakes did not forgive. They killed. Behind him, the German formation began to stretch. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough for trained eyes to notice. Some aircraft climbed more aggressively, trying to close the distance before the American stalled. Others held back slightly, anticipating the moment he would level off or roll away. They were certain that moment was coming. No aircraft could hold this climb for long. Not at this weight. Not without losing control. The Thunderbolt kept climbing. The airspeed dropped further. The aircraft trembled, not violently, but insistently, as if reminding him how close he was to the edge. He resisted the urge to push forward. That urge was old. Instinctive. It had saved lives before. It had also killed men who trusted it too much. He kept the nose where it was. Not higher, not lower. Balanced on the narrow line where lift still existed. One of the German fighters began to shake first. Its pilot pulled harder, trying to match the climb angle, forcing his aircraft to do something it did not want to do. The engine coughed. The nose wavered. Then it dropped slightly as the pilot eased off, trading altitude back for control. Another fighter followed, then another, each one peeling away not because they were afraid, but because they had reached the limit their machines would tolerate. This was the moment when certainty began to erode. German radios filled with short, sharp calls. Altitude checks. Warnings. Frustration creeping into voices that had been calm minutes earlier. They were not panicking. Not yet. But something was wrong. The American was still climbing, still holding the angle, still alive. The physics they trusted were no longer behaving the way they expected. The Thunderbolt climbed past the band where most fights ended, past the altitude where men felt comfortable chasing anything. Frost crept along the edges of the canopy. Breathing became deliberate. Every inhalation mattered. The engine gauges held steady, not perfectly, but well enough. The machine was not giving up. Below him now, the German fighters looked different. Smaller, less threatening. Their movement lacked purpose. Some circled. Some turned away entirely, unwilling to sacrifice their aircraft for a certainty that no longer felt certain. The trap had not failed violently. It had simply stopped working. Up here, alone in thinning air, the American pilot understood something else. Victory did not always mean destruction. Sometimes it meant refusing to die when the enemy was convinced you must. Sometimes it meant climbing beyond the reach of expectation itself. And that was when the German radios finally said what mattered. Anger, not curses, just disbelief. He's climbing away. We can't match him. That sentence, spoken into static by men who had seen too much to be easily surprised, marked the real turning point. Not of the fight, but of the idea that governed it. The moment when the old rule never climb, when surrounded, lost its authority. The American held the climb a little longer. Long enough to be sure. Long enough to let certainty drain out of the sky below him. Then, only then, did he level off. The fight did not end with a kill. It ended with absence. The absence of pursuers. The absence of gunfire. The absence of certainty on the radios below him. At that altitude, the Thunderbolt existed in a different kind of space. One most pilots never visited for long enough to matter. The air was thin, the sky darker, the noise reduced to the steady, stubborn thunder of a radial engine doing work it was never supposed to do for this long. Below him, the battle continued without him. Bombers droned forward, escorted by fighters who would never know how close one of their own had come to vanishing. German aircraft regrouped, reformed, returned to familiar altitudes where the rules still felt reliable. No one chased the American upward anymore. There was nothing to gain there, only risk. He leveled off carefully, letting the aircraft settle. The controls firmed slightly as the climb ended, still soft, still demanding attention. Frost coated the canopy edges. His breath fogged the mask with each measured inhale. He checked his gauges again, not out of disbelief, but out of habit. Temperatures high but manageable. Pressure holding. Fuel lower than he liked, but enough. The machine had not betrayed him. In war, survival is rarely witnessed. There are no crowds for it, no applause. This moment passed unseen by friend and enemy alike, save for a few distant aircraft and a handful of voices on German radios that would later be written down, translated, filed away. He had no proof, no gun camera footage, no witnesses who could vouch for what had just happened. Only his word, and the fact that he was still alive. When he finally eased the nose down and began a controlled descent, the world slowly returned to scale. Speed built. The aircraft grew solid again beneath his hands. By the time he rejoined friendly airspace, the Thunderbolt felt like it always had heavy, reliable, unapologetic. He radioed his position and slid back into the escort without ceremony. No one asked where he had been. There was no time for stories in the middle of a mission. Later, on the ground, the event became paperwork. A routine after-action report. Engaged multiple enemy fighters. Evaded through climb. Returned to station. The intelligence officer reading it raised an eyebrow at the reported altitude, but did not challenge it. P-47 seconds were known to perform well high. Perhaps this pilot had simply pushed harder than most. War was full of anomalies. Not all of them needed to be resolved. But stories have a way of leaking out, even in wartime. Over coffee, over drinks, in the quiet moments between missions when men compared notes not to boast, but to understand how close they were to dying. Someone asked how he got away. He answered plainly, "No drama, no embellishment." He told them he went up. He told them it worked. At first, they laughed. 35,000 feet in a jug, climbing, under pressure, with enemies behind you, it sounded like a misunderstanding, or bravado, or a lucky fluke. But then others began to test it. Not in combat at first, just in climbs, just to see. They pushed their Thunderbolts higher than they normally would, watched the gauges, felt the controls, and what they found unsettled them. The aircraft kept going. Above 30,000 feet, where German fighters began to lose their authority, the Thunderbolt still had something left. Not speed, not grace, but power. Enough to hold altitude. Enough to deny pursuit. Enough to change the geometry of a fight. This is how doctrine really changes. Not through orders or memos, but through quiet experiments carried out by men who had survived once and did not want to test fate again. The idea spread slowly, then faster. P-47 flights began positioning themselves higher. Not always, not recklessly, but when the situation allowed, altitude became something more than a starting point. It became leverage. Germans noticed. Interrogations of captured pilots confirmed it. Above a certain height, their aircraft struggled. Engines starved. Climb rates collapsed. They adjusted in turn, forcing fights lower when they could, avoiding prolonged vertical pursuits when they could not. The dance continued, but the balance had shifted. What began as one man's refusal to accept a rule had turned into a crack in the structure that supported it. The Thunderbolt, once dismissed as too heavy to dominate the vertical, earned a new reputation. Not as a dogfighter, not as a climber in the traditional sense, but as an aircraft you did not chase upward if you wanted to come back down. And that was the true consequence of the climb. Not the escape itself, but the knowledge it left behind. The understanding that altitude was not just danger, it was potential, and that the machine, when trusted and understood, could carry you farther into that potential than anyone expected. Wars are not changed by moments. They are changed by what men do with those moments afterward. The climb itself lasted only minutes. Its consequences stretched far longer. Quietly, without ceremony, the meaning of altitude began to shift in the minds of the people who survived long enough to think about it. Before that day, height was something you managed, a buffer, a reserve. You climbed to attack, dove to escape, and stayed where the fight felt controllable. Above a certain band, aircraft became unreliable, pilots became slow, and mistakes became fatal. That belief shaped every engagement, every escort pattern, every interception. It was not superstition. It was experience hardened into doctrine. But doctrine is only strong until reality embarrasses it. What unsettled pilots was not that the Thunderbolt had climbed. It was that it had climbed when it should not have. Under pressure, outnumbered, with no margin for error, and it had not failed. That forced a re-evaluation that went deeper than one aircraft or one encounter. It forced men to ask where the limits they trusted actually came from. Engineers had numbers, charts, performance curves. But combat had a way of exposing the difference between what was theoretically possible and what men dared to attempt. The turbo supercharger had always been there. Its advantage at altitude was known on paper. What had been missing was proof under threat, proof that it would hold when everything else was trying to pull you back down. Once that proof existed, it spread, not as a proclamation, but as permission. Pilots began to see altitude differently, not as a ceiling, but as a space the enemy could not comfortably occupy. P-47 flights started to position themselves higher when fuel allowed. Not always, not recklessly, but deliberately. From that band, they could choose when to dive, or choose not to. And if a fight went wrong, they had somewhere to go that did not immediately turn into a chase. This changed the psychology of pursuit. German pilots were no longer chasing prey that would inevitably run downward. Now there was hesitation, a calculation. If the American pulled up, should you follow? Could you follow? And if you committed and lost power, who would be above you then? That hesitation mattered. In air combat, half a second of doubt is often more decisive than a second of fire. Captured pilots later confirmed what Allied airmen had begun to suspect. Above certain altitudes, German engines struggled. Their climb rates collapsed. Their margin vanished. They could still fight, but only if the fight stayed where they wanted it. The sky was no longer neutral. It had layers, and not all of them favored the same aircraft. The Thunderbolt did not become something it was not. It did not turn into a graceful dogfighter. It did not outclimb everything in all conditions. What it became was situationally dominant. In the right band of air, at the right moment, it held a card the enemy could not match. And that was enough. This is how warfare actually evolves, not through sudden revolutions, but through small shifts in understanding that accumulate until the old assumptions no longer work. One pilot survives in an unexpected way. Others listen. Experiments follow. Patterns change. And eventually, what once sounded impossible becomes routine. By the time the war ended, energy management in the vertical plane was no longer an afterthought. Doctrine. Altitude was taught not just as position, but as stored advantage. Modern pilots would later learn the mathematics behind it: specific excess power, sustained climb rates, thrust-to-weight ratios. But the truth came first, written without equations, high above Europe in thin air that did not behave the way men expected it to. The Thunderbolt would fade. Jets would replace pistons. The sky would change. But the lesson endured. Not every escape lies in speed. Not every rule survives contact with reality. And sometimes, the only way out is the direction everyone agrees will kill you. Survival does not make headlines. It never has. War remembers victories that leave wreckage, not escapes that leave only silence. When the mission ended and the aircraft were parked, no one gathered around him to ask what had happened above 30,000 feet. There was no citation written for refusing to die. No medal pinned on a uniform for choosing the one direction everyone agreed was fatal. He flew again. And again. He survived the war, which was achievement enough for anyone who had watched men disappear between briefings and dinner. He went home when it was over. Like most of them, he did not build his life around the moments when he almost died. Those moments stayed where they belonged, inside, quiet, rarely spoken. Years later, historians would reconstruct the air war with charts and summaries. They would count sorties, losses, victories. They would list aircraft by speed, range, armament. The P-47 Thunderbolt would earn its place in those records. Tough, reliable, brutally effective. Thousands built, thousands lost. Thousands more bringing pilots home through fire and flak. But that climb would remain a footnote, if it appeared at all. There was no film of it, no dramatic proof. Only a few lines in reports. A handful of radio intercepts translated and archived. A sentence spoken by an enemy pilot who could not understand what he was seeing. And one man's memory of thin air, fading controls, and an engine that kept doing its job when everything else said it should not. That is how many truths survive war. Not as lessons announced, but as knowledge passed quietly from one survivor to another. At reunions, in interviews late in life. In the careful way, old pilots spoke about their machines not with romance, but with respect. They said the Thunderbolt was not pretty, not graceful, but it was honest. It told you what it could do, if you bothered to listen. Modern pilots study equations now. Energy diagrams, thrust-to-weight ratios, excess power curves. They learn to think in vertical planes and probabilities. The language has changed. The machines are unrecognizable, but the principle is the same. Altitude is not just height, it is choice. And the aircraft that can give you more choices, when you have none left, is the one that matters. The Thunderbolt eventually faded into museums and scrapyards. Jets took its place. The sky grew faster, colder, more distant. Visitors walk past preserved airframes today, reading plaques that list specifications and armament. Few mention the turbo supercharger. Fewer still explain what it meant to the men who trusted it when instinct failed. But those men remembered. They remembered that war does not reward brilliance as often as it rewards understanding. That machines are not miracles, but they are not limits either. And that sometimes the difference between life and death is not strength or speed, but the willingness to question a rule everyone else obeys without thinking. On that day, surrounded and outnumbered, one pilot chose to go up when every voice training, experience, and enemy expectation told him that up was death. He did not change the war. He did not need to. He changed one assumption, and that was enough to carry him home. After the war, people asked the wrong questions. They asked which aircraft was faster, which one turned tighter, which pilot had the better kill score. Those were clean questions. Comfortable questions. They fit neatly into books and documentaries and museum labels. The harder question was this: how many men survived because someone once proved a rule was wrong? That number will never be written down. What survives instead is a pattern, a quiet one. Time and again, war punishes those who mistake habit for law. Germans that day did not lose because they flew poorly or fought without courage. They lost because they trusted a certainty that had never truly been tested under pressure. They believed the sky ended where their experience told them it should. And when someone crossed that line, they had no answer ready. The American pilot did not win by being braver. He won by being precise. By knowing his machine deeply enough to recognize a possibility where others saw only risk. That kind of knowledge is not dramatic. It does not shout. It waits. And when the moment comes, it offers a single, narrow path most people will never see. This is why wars are remembered incorrectly. We remember explosions. We remember victories. We remember names carved into stone. But the real inheritance of war is quieter. It lives in altered procedures, in rewritten manuals, in instincts passed down that began as heresy. Every modern pilot is taught that altitude is energy, that vertical space is opportunity, that escape does not always lie in speed or firepower. Those ideas feel obvious now. They were not obvious then. They were paid for, once, by a man willing to climb into air that was supposed to kill him. And this is the final truth war leaves behind. Survival is not about doing what feels right in the moment. It is about doing what reality allows, even when instinct, tradition, and the enemy all agree you are wrong. That day, the sky did not change. The aircraft did not change. Only one assumption did. And sometimes, That is all it takes.